Hello and good evening, everybody. It's me, Julian, and today I hope that you will join me for a close examination, a close reading, as it were, of page 498 in Slavoj Žižek's magnum opus on Hegel, titled Less Than Nothing. And the passage that we're going to be focusing on specifically is titled The Limits of Hegel. And what I'd like to do in this 20-minute video, let's say, is explain Žižek's Lacanian approach to Hegel, but perhaps specifically emphasize an example, a reading, as it were, in which Žižek points out a Lacanian passage in Hegel, essentially where Hegel is being Lacanian avant la lettre, as it were. And I'm going to jump right in, and then we'll sort of take it step by step. So the passage that I want to focus on today is really interesting. It's the conclusion of Hegel's Encyclopedia, in which Hegel writes the following sentence, and I will read it out in German first, and then I'll give you the English translation. Hegel writes, Die ewige und für sich seiende Idee, sich ewig als absoluter Geist betätigt, erzeugt und genießt. Now, what makes the sentence so interesting will become clear when I read it out to you in English. The English translation goes like this. The eternal idea, which exists in and for itself, eternally sets itself to work, engenders and enjoys itself as absolute spirit. And what's so fascinating about this passage is that here we have Hegel writing about spirit enjoying itself. Spirit, the Hegelian notion of the eternal idea, somehow experiencing a kind of enjoyment, as Hegel puts it in German, und genießt, Geist genießt. It's such an unusual passage in Hegel. And what I'd like to do in this short video is explain why Žižek highlights this passage and subjects it, no pun intended, to a Lacanian psychoanalytic reading along the lines of the subject supposed to enjoy, otherwise known as the subject of the unconscious or the subject of drive. And if that sounds like a lot of technical gobbledygook, and indeed it is, fret not. I will also try to use this video to stage a brief introduction to some key Hegelian and Lacanian topics. That is my proposal for today. This is going to be a close reading, a masterclass of sorts, an unapologetically technical video for those of you philosophically inclined. And once again, if you'd like to read the book yourself, it's called Less Than Nothing, Žižek's lengthiest book on Hegel. Of course, if you'd like to support my work, you can also download my latest ebook titled The Objective Illusion, which is an introduction to Kant, Lacan, Žižek, and Hegel. But okay, let's begin. One of Lacan's arguments that I think is really important to understand, and it's a very simple argument, is that there is a difference between desire and drive. Desire is when something is lacking and you want to have it. Like you're unhappy because you don't have it. You could say, for example, what I really want to have is, I don't know, a pen instead of a pencil. Desire, which revolves around an object that is lost or lacking. Against this, we have what you might call the logic of drive. And the logic of drive is the process by which lack or loss takes on a properly constitutive function, which is to say it's a failure which becomes its own triumph, as it were. For example, if you're playing a difficult video game and you're trying to defeat the boss, what makes it enjoyable is that it's hard. You keep doing it over and over again, and it doesn't even really serve a purpose. Like if you beat the game, you simply go and play another game. And this type of repetition is enjoyable. And Lacan's argument, building upon Freud, is that this is what makes us properly human. that we enjoy futility, that we derive pleasure, perhaps even satisfaction, from doing repetitive things that are strictly speaking pointless. Like, think about it. You go for a walk. You could create this utilitarian argument that you're doing it for your mental health, but really you're doing it because it's nice to go for a walk. When we have conversations with friends, it's not just to learn new things, it's because we enjoy having a conversation with friends. On a very basic level, to be properly human is to engage in things for the sake of doing them. Art for art's sake, food for food's sake. In fact, one of the symptoms of alienation, the process by which we feel detached from our own selves, is precisely the feeling that we can only justify doing something if it serves some other purpose, preferably the creation of capital. For example, you can only enjoy a meal if you post it on Instagram so as to create social status, which will then give you, I don't know, better prospects in life or something. This utilitarian argument that you should only do something if it benefits you somehow in monetary terms or in terms of status or health is itself a symptom of an alienated life. Even the idea, for example, like if you pick up a Men's Health magazine that says, here is why sex is beneficial for your heart, for example. Even here we have this logic at work, that you should do the thing not for itself, but for some other utilitarian means. Now, this doesn't mean that it's not true. Having sex is probably good for your heart to some extent, but the point is that what we really enjoy on the level of drive is the thing for its own sake, which strictly speaking means we enjoy the thing for its very failure. We enjoy doing it over and over again. Even on the level of the neurotic. A neurotic is someone who simply stages a short circuit of drive, like scratching themselves incessantly because they can't express themselves in some other way, or pulling their hair out, etc. Many neuroses function around and revolve around repetition, and yet one of the secrets is that it is enjoyable in some way to be stuck in this sense. And according to Lacanian psychoanalysis, what makes us properly human is that not only do we enjoy being stuck in this way, but we can actually be very creative. We can be very free in this stuckness, as it were, this self-relating negativity, to put it in Žižekian terms. In fact, here we can see the difference between negation as such and self-relating negativity. Hegel's one of the first thinkers to really bring these into dialectical, if you will, relationship with each other. Let me briefly take the Lacanian theme of desire and drive and apply it, for example, to Kant and Hegel. Desire, to recap, revolves around a loss, an object of loss. I don't have it, so I want it. Drive revolves around the not having it as such. Like, drive is when the thing that you are lacking, the thing that you are failing to do, becomes its own purpose, as it were, becomes pleasurable in its failure, in its repetition. Now, one of the things that Žižek argues, I think quite convincingly, is that the Kantian metaphysical project revolves around a logic of desire, which is to say, loss. Kant's metaphysical problem is how can we access the thing in itself, essence versus appearance. And as I've said many times before, to simplify somewhat, the Kantian problem is that we can't really access essence in its pure universal state, because even the concept of essence is already a phenomenal appearance, i.e. it is mediated through subjective reason. Hence, it is always already in advance, a priori, as Kant puts it, no longer pure or universal or essence. Hence, the Kantian metaphysical logic revolves around this loss, the loss of a pure metaphysical object of desire, Platonic truth, essence. Against this, and this is Žižek's interpretation, against this Kantian logic of loss, we have the Hegelian, Lacanian logic of lack, which is to say, the Hegelian position, apropos Kant, isn't one of loss of the pure, essential, metaphysical object, but instead the process by which this very loss is enacted repeatedly through and in spirit. Spirit being for Hegel the manifestation of the immanent contradictions between subject and substance as such. In other words, to put it somewhat more simply, Hegel's position is that the very failure to access essence in its purity is itself the universal precondition for essence to appear as such, namely within appearance itself. Hegel's maxim being not essence versus appearance, which would once again be predicated on the logic of loss of the ideal object in the world of phenomenal appearance, the Kantian metaphysic, against the logic of lack, essence as appearance qua appearance. The very failure for essence to be pure, as it were, therefore constitutes negatively, hence the constitutive negativity, a kind of essence as such. Now, I want to briefly return back to Žižek's text, because remember, the passage that we started with is the conclusion from Hegel's Encyclopedia, in which Hegel makes the remarkable observation that spirit is not only tätig, erzeugend, but also spirit genießt. And this is one of those classic Hegelian triads. Like, even the word sublation in Hegel has three different meanings. It's the process by which something is aufgehoben, namely it is both elevated, retained, and eliminated. And here we have another one of those Hegelian triads. In fact, side note, Hegel, despite and perhaps precisely because he is difficult to read in German, is a thinker who enjoys language immensely. Hegel is a very literary thinker, not in terms of poetic renditions, but in his very precise and playful use of language. And here we have another one of these Hegelian triads. We have absoluter Geist, betätigt, erzeugt und genießt. Betätigt means that it sets to work, right? It sets itself to work. It goes out to work. Erzeugen, which is to engender or create something. And then finally, genießt. Geist genießt. This is a Hegelian alliteration. This is Hegel being playful with the German language. Geist betätigt, erzeugt und genießt. It's a rhetorical statement as much as anything else, because think about it. To set yourself to work, to create and to enjoy is itself practically the definition of drive. To go out, to create something, to do it again, essentially, and to enjoy the process of so doing. In other words, Hegel is being Lacanian avant la lettre here. Hegel's essentially saying that spirit, absoluter Geist, is enjoying itself. And he characterizes spirit as being the eternal idea which exists in and for itself. Okay, let's take this a step back. But it's a fun passage, I think you have to admit. The idea of spirit enjoying itself in its creation. So what can we imagine by spirit enjoying itself? Well, here I would like to direct you to page 499, in which Žižek writes the following. He writes, "We become quote-unquote humans when we get caught up in a closed self-propelling loop of repeating the same gesture and finding satisfaction in it. We can all recall the archetypal cartoon scene. A cat jumps into the air and turns on its own axis. But instead of plunging back down in accordance with the normal laws of gravity, it remains suspended, turning around in the levitated position as if caught in a loop of time, repeating the same circular movement over and over again. In such moments," and this is the key passage, "in such moments, the quote-unquote normal run of things, of being caught in the imbecilic inertia of material reality," this would itself be a good book title, the imbecilic inertia of material reality, "is for a brief moment suspended. We enter the magical domain of suspended animation. of a kind of self-sustaining ethereal rotation. This rotary movement, in which the linear progress of time is suspended in a repetitive loop, is the drive at its most elementary. This passage is really helpful, I think, when it comes to understanding why Žižek uses the Lacanian theory of drive to characterize the Hegelian metaphysical idea. And let me explain why. The traditional image of Hegel is that Hegel is the solipsistic monster of the absolute. Hegel is a kind of puppet master or grand wizard in his nightgown at home who has calculated in advance the foreseeable future of a kind of predetermined mechanized arch of the universe, which is to say the Hegelian idea of spirit is usually characterized and mischaracterized as a kind of grand theory of becoming, that you could step back and watch the unfolding of the world and indeed of history according to a preordained deterministic logic. And yet that's really not what Hegel is about. If you read Hegel closely, you'll realize that what Hegel calls eternal is precisely not the linear development of the idea. As I've said before, thesis, antithesis, synthesis is not a linear progression from thesis into antithesis and thereby into synthesis. In fact, the entire Hegelian project argues against this type of Fichtean and Kantian formalism. And what I mean by formalism is an argument that functions according to these objective or supposedly objective categories from which the subject can count itself out as the supposedly neutral arbiter and observer of predetermined a priori essences and appearances. Against this, the Hegelian argument is at least twofold. Number one, what appears as a thesis, namely an object in the world, a thing, is always already itself the result of a self-contained, i.e. immanent, negation, which therefore means that every thesis is always already its own synthesis, both in advance and posteriori, as it were. Which is to say, when Hegel calls something eternal, he doesn't mean that it's eternal in terms of starting at A and moving until an unforeseeable endpoint. No. What Hegel means is that the eternal mechanism lies within the self-relating negativity of any object as such. Which is to say, any object in the world is the manifestation, if you will, the fruitful failure of essence in its own becoming into that which appears to be its antithesis, namely object, which therefore becomes the staging ground of essence. Now, that's very technical, but if you think about it, the essentialist idealist binary is essence versus appearance, truth versus object, pure universal versus subjective particular reason. Hegel's argument runs against Kantian formalism. Kant's formalism holds that essence comes first and that reason is the negation of essence, hence essence remains an object of loss. It is negated in and through reason, hence it is lost. Hegel argues against this, that there is no a priori essence. Instead, the eternal is itself the structure of negation qua negation, or appearance qua negation. Reason, the subject, negates something which was not there in advance, but which appears only through its own absence. Namely, essence is not the formal content of the ideal. Instead, and this is crucial, instead essence is the content hidden within the structure of the impossibility of the ideal to emerge as form. Let me reiterate that, because this is the most important thing you could possibly understand about Hegel, and it is difficult. Content versus form. Content is what something is. Form is how it relates to other things. For example, my left hand is a hand. My right hand is also a hand. The content appears similar, except in inverse. The formal relationship to these hands is that they are attached to my body and correspond to my brain. In other words, we have the content of hand, and then we have the formal structure of their interrelationship. This is what you might call the content hidden in the form, the content of the form as such. Hegel says, let's reject the idealist content, the object of metaphysical loss, the thing in itself, the hand, as it were. Instead, let's look at the structure between essence and appearance, the content in the form. Except the obvious problem is that the content of essence can't be known because of the content of reason. They cancel each other out. They negate each other. And so for Hegel, the only idealist content can be the content that is hidden in the form as to the ideal content's impossible appearance. Its own failure to appear in and through subjective reason contains its very truth, i.e. the content within the form of its own impossibility. Very technical, but this is really what Hegel is trying to say. Let me reiterate once again, and thank you for your patience. Loss versus lack. Loss revolves around an object that is missing. Like, I've lost my pencil. It's gone. For Kant, what is gone or what is missing is essence, truth. It can't be reached. Why? Because subjective reason turns it into a concept, hence it is no longer pure. This means that the very thought of pure or essence is itself its impossibility. It's a paradox, as it were. Hegel says yes, but Kant is focusing on the content of loss, namely that which is lost, the object of desire, the metaphysical pure object. Against this, Hegel argues that we have to look at the content in the form. So what is the form? The form is the process by which reason creates a paradox that means that essence can no longer be pure. Hence, the impossibility of reaching the object of metaphysical idealism, the object of desire, is transmuted into, to put it in Lacanian terms, an object of lack. After all, what is lack? Lack is a constitutive negativity. The transition from desire to drive therefore stages an ontological shift. Desire revolves around a gap, a loss. Lack revolves around a constitutive negativity in which this loss is redoubled unto itself and becomes its own thing, its own impossible object, what Lacan would call the objet petit a. Hence, what Žižek does, and this is quite brilliant, I think, is that Žižek argues that the Hegelian spirit can be interpreted according to the logic of lack, namely the objet petit a. This is Žižek's main insight, to apply the eternal recurrence, as it were, that lies at the heart of lack and which structures the objet petit a as an impossible object, namely not an object of content, but an object of form, the content within the immutable, i.e. impossible structure of form. and to then use this logic of lack, which is the logic of drive, right? Drive being the recurrence, that is the impossibility, the constitutive impossibility of overcoming desire or loss. And this rotary movement, which is how Žižek characterizes it, like the cat spinning, is the movement of Hegelian spirit. Hence, it is eternal, not because it's moving from a predetermined point of origin to some never-ending point X. Instead, what is eternal about it is this very recurrence, this very impossibility. If you will, essentially, he's arguing that Hegel has created a kind of beautiful, neurotic drive, and he has put it into philosophy. Philosophy as this never-ending, impossible metaphysical project that nevertheless provides satisfaction and enjoyment. And now we're back at Hegel's conclusion in the Encyclopedia. Spirit, if you'll allow me to read it out once more, the eternal idea being code for essence, which exists in and for itself. In other words, it doesn't exist simply in itself, a priori, but becomes actualized for itself, i.e. is mediated or negated eternally, namely on the level of recurrent form, sets itself to work, engenders and enjoys itself as absolute spirit. In other words, this passage in Hegel argues that the eternal idea is not absolute. It does not exist a priori, except for the process by which it falls into its own immanent negation, the self-relating negativity of setting itself to work, engendering itself, and thereby enjoying itself. How does spirit do this? In and through the subject. Hence, to go back to page 499, when Žižek writes, we become humans when we get caught up in a closed self-propelling loop of repeating the same gesture and finding satisfaction in it, we could say essence becomes human when it gets caught up in the self-sustaining loop, which is subjective reason. And vice versa, the dialectical insight is that humans become ideal or absolute when they find themselves caught in essence. Hence, once again, for Hegel, it's not essence versus appearance, the ideal or absolute versus the particular subjective reason, but instead it is essence as appearance. Namely, negation is not the negation between reason, the particular, and the ideal, the absolute. Instead, it is self-relating negativity, the logic of Lacanian drive, which lies at the heart of the Hegelian metaphysic. Hence, Žižek applies the Lacanian logic of drive, which is the logic of lack, the subject of the unconscious, the subject of enjoyment, to the Hegelian metaphysical operation, and essentially argues that Hegel's position can be understood through Lacanian, or through a Lacanian lens. And what's so fun about this passage, why I wanted to dedicate a half-hour lecture to just reading this passage, is that here we have Hegel making the argument that spirit enjoys itself. And this is very radical. This is very, in many ways, very wrong, almost. The suggestion that spirit could somehow be thought of as a person enjoying itself. This is Hegel being contrarian and having a little bit of fun, but in a very serious sense. Hence the rhetoric, right? Geist betätigt, erzeugt und genießt. Spirit as a creative entity of enjoyment. And what is creativity if not the enjoyment of futility, the enjoyment of failure? Hence, the subject of reason is the failure of spirit to know itself. And this very failure creates or constitutes enjoyment, the enjoyment of spirit. Hence, last week's lecture was titled The Subject Supposed to Enjoy. And perhaps today's lecture could be called The Spirit Supposed to Enjoy. That is my close reading of the Limits of Hegel, page 498 and 499 in Žižek's Less Than Nothing, his magnum opus on Hegel. I'm going to be hosting a post-lecture discussion on Discord, so you can join me there. Discord is available to our patrons. Thank you to everyone on Patreon. But above all, thank you to everybody who has joined me live today. It brings me so much joy. Truly, it brings me so much pleasure to be here with you today, just geeking out about philosophy and theory unapologetically. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon.